Special edition, folks. Michigan State and Ohio State going at it on Saturday in East Lansing. The Buckeyes' first road test in quotes, possibly, we shall see, of 2022. And again, special edition Buckeyes Live here on a Friday morning. We wanted to talk to Pat Murphy and thought we should include all of you to leave your comments and questions for the next 45 minutes or so here at the Voice of College Football. So please take advantage of that. You ultimately produce the show. Pat, how you doing today?
I am good. It's Friday before game day. We're going to head up to East Lansing here tomorrow morning. So looking forward to it. First road trip of the season for the Buckeyes, which is weird to say because it's week 6.
It is week 6. Columbus to East Lansing. I'm going to take a shot at this. What are we looking at? 3.5 hours?
Yeah. Usually about 3.5. It's been 4 given road construction, traffic, those type of things. But typically, 3.5. So we're going to go up tomorrow. We'll go straight up there and then come back about halfway after the game so we can get back earlier on Sunday. Debated going up today. Steve Hellwagon, who I know all your people know well, had some stuff going on this evening. So we're just going to wait and do it in the morning. But it's a pretty easy drive as long as you don't hit anything crazy along the way.
You know, Pat, last season we went into the Michigan State game. Both teams were ranked in the top 10. I specifically remember having the conversation with you. This is crazy. This is like I don't remember what the point spread was. It was north of 3 touchdowns, whatever it was, 21, 25, something in that range. And I was like, come on, are you serious? Really? And, Ohio State doubled up the point spread like in the first half,
right.
49-0. And now we have a very different Michigan State team in regards to quality of play, almost out of the division race already. And they haven't even faced any of the top 3, just a very different setting. Although it's still the Big Ten, it's still a program where Ohio State's had issues in the past and it's on the road. So there are those things that create challenges potentially.
Certainly. I mean, anytime you go into a Big Ten game, as we know, especially on the road, and Ohio State fans will think back to Iowa and Purdue. Now, it's been a while since they've had those issues on the road. But I looked back just to see. I was like, I can't remember. Obviously, the big win in 2015 with Michigan State was in Columbus. So I was looking back. It's been since 1999 since Ohio State's lost at Michigan State, which is crazy to me because there have been some really good games up there. I mean, even Urban Meyer's first year, it wasn't a good game, but Ohio State went up there and had to get out of town with a 17-16 win. There's been some other closer ones too. So, yeah, I was a little bit hesitant when we were, doing our predictions and whatnot. I don't think that's come out yet, but to go too big. And then I was on a radio show that our Michigan State writer, Stephen Brooks, does up in East Lansing, their local radio there. And he was so despondent about this team and just the secondary's terrible and all this stuff. And I was like, well, maybe this will be a cakewalk for the Buckeyes. But I can certainly think that way. Ohio State probably shouldn't because that's how you get Iowa and Purdue.
Yeah, I think we should all understand that. We can say whatever we want.
Right.
And
doesn't affect them.
The only thing, it doesn't affect the players. It only matters, they can be playing a high school team tomorrow and, they need to be focused on it. We can say whatever and predict whatever we want. Unless you're a Buckeye fan who doesn't want to get embarrassed on Sunday and be talking about, a game that you predicted as a 5-touchdown win that turns into an upset loss. But besides that, doesn't matter what we have to say. We just have fun watching the games and talking it up. A lot was made at various places about CJ Stroud's performance against Rutgers, maybe not being on point, maybe him dropping back a little bit, not executing to his standard or the standard for the position.
Well, I think Ryan Day summed it up pretty well. And going back and looking at the film, I think he made some really good points. Rutgers came in with a defensive game plan to eliminate the big play passing attack. And if you go and watch a lot of NFL teams against a Patrick Mahomes, against a Tom Brady, those explosive attacks, they play that too high shell that just keeps everything in front. And they do it in different ways. And that's what Greg Schiano and Rutgers deployed was let's not let CJ Stroud just throw the ball all over us, hit on those big plays. And so they made it difficult for Ohio State to get what they needed. And what I think CJ Stroud did well is not getting baited into, except for one play, which was a called play to take a shot coming out of halftime when he threw the interception. He didn't just, try and force it downfield over and over again to get those stats, right? He took what the defense was giving him. The Buckeyes were fine with just running the ball and picking up 5-6 yards at a time, throwing the underneath stuff. And then obviously, they hit on a big play with Mayan Williams' 70-yard run and things like that. So I think it's an interesting game plan from Rutgers. And also, Rutgers did a good job of limiting possessions for Ohio State because their offense took their sweet time. And we saw Notre Dame do a little bit of this too. And I think this is what you're going to see teams try to attack the Buckeyes with defensively and maybe an overall game plan because they want to limit what CJ Stroud and this offense as a whole, but especially this passing attack can do. So, we've seen CJ Stroud put up great numbers already this season. It's not like he's struggled. And I wouldn't even say last week was a struggle. There were a few times where I think Marvin Harrison got his defender called for holding twice in the end zone, or once in the end zone and once maybe close. It could have been a touchdown if I remember correctly. So, if those hit and there aren't penalties on that, you're talking about, more touchdowns for CJ Stroud. Marvin Harrison steps out the back of the end zone on the one play that negates a touchdown. So it could have been a huge day for CJ Stroud, even with the way Rutgers was playing defense. And let's give Rutgers a little bit of credit here. That defense has gotten better every year under Greg Schiano. And Ohio State fans know well what Greg Schiano can do with the defense. And that's the side of the ball that has progressed for Rutgers. So, I think you'll see more of this. And I think Ohio State will continue to figure out ways to get wins, but also to get CJ Stroud some stats. I mean, let's be clear. Ryan Day can say all he wants that they're fine with winning, running the ball and whatnot. Ryan Day's a quarterback by nature. He would love to have a Heisman Trophy quarterback on his resume, his coaching resume. And, you saw in the red zone, Ohio State, I think it was almost 50-50 throwing and passing inside the 10. So they were looking to get CJ Stroud some stats. That ultimately you want to win the game, but they aren't unaware of the fact that CJ Stroud could be a Heisman winner if he puts up some big numbers.
Pat, he was asked that question in regards to the Heisman pursuit affecting play calling. And I even thought it was telling that, the answer was fine, made total sense. The team first, we were trying to win football games. We can't be concerned with that. But I think most coaches would just shut that off and say, are you kidding me? We don't even consider, we're not even thinking of, you could tell that there was some thought to it that, yes, it's that's a goal. That's I don't want to call it a priority. That's a consideration. But yes, we will never let that affect what we're doing. But I think he laid it out perfectly. That's something that he would like to get accomplished for CJ himself. Yeah.
Right. And I think there's two things when you look at it. First, when you have a Heisman contender and you're not a national championship contender, it makes it easier to have a Heisman campaign, right? You can go to that guy, whatever the position may be. Now, recently we've seen much more, Alabama's had some, Clemson, those guys, there's been contenders on national championship teams. And then you just kind of have to, along with winning games, those guys have to put up numbers. What I think is most important for CJ Stroud now, and let's remember, after the Heisman Trophy last year, he finished fourth, the ceremony. He told us at the Rose Bowl that he was disappointed with that finish and that was going to be a motivating factor for him. Now, his tone has changed this offseason, and he's become much more about winning and doing whatever the team needs. And I think that's honesty from him. I think that's the maturity and growth of CJ Stroud. And I also think he realizes, look, a Heisman Trophy would certainly cement his legacy as a great Buckeye player, but he also needs a Big Ten title. He also needs to beat Michigan. And if he wins a national championship, that will be just as good as winning a Heisman Trophy. Now, if you can do both in the same year, fantastic, right? But I think it's occurred to CJ that winning will take care of these things, and he'll be in the conversation. whether they, as long as they keep winning, and obviously he was last year, but beating Michigan, Big Ten championship, national championship, those are things a quarterback needs on his resume to be remembered as a great player for Ohio State. I mean, Justin Fields doesn't have a Heisman Trophy. Dwayne Haskins doesn't have a Heisman Trophy. They were both Heisman finalists. CJ Stroud already accomplished that. They both beat Michigan. They both won Big Ten championships. They both, I guess Dwayne Haskins didn't go to the College Football Playoff, but Justin Fields, I mean, you can go on and on with quarterbacks who haven't won Heisman trophies and are well respected within Buckeye Nation.
Yeah, absolutely. Always enjoyed the conversation with Pat Murphy. You can join his work at 247 Sports, bucknuts.com. Get on over there. Get yourself prepped for the Michigan State game. Keep updated on everything Ohio State related, football, basketball, and otherwise there at bucknuts.com. And, just one other note on the way teams will play Ohio State. It also comes down to math, of course. It's basically you force them to drive the field. It chews up the clock. If Ohio State's got to drive at 5 or 6 minutes to get into the red zone, maybe you make a play on defense and you force them into a field goal. That's almost a victory of sorts. Even if they score a touchdown, it took them 7 or 8 minutes, and you start doing the math. And if your offense can at least sustain drives, then you're limiting them to probably between 1 and at the most 2 possessions per quarter. And you just do the math and you figure it out from there. It was almost what Oregon did. And Oregon never stopped Ohio State on offense. They threw for 500 yards, but they didn't have the ball that much when it was all said and done. And they scored 4 times and they got stymied in the red zone a few times. And before you know it, it's a 28 points on the board. But against Ohio State, that's a victory. So there you go.
Well, and one thing too is specifically for the Rutgers game, Ohio State took over at least twice, maybe more, right around midfield. There was the onside kick Rutgers attempted. There was the turnover. I guess there were 2 turnovers. So that's short fields where you're putting up fewer statistics because you're not driving as far, to kind of similar to your point. There's just not as much field to put up more yards. So that was another kind of quirky thing about that game that, they started 2 drives right around midfield and 1 drive inside the 30 maybe after the Steel Chambers interception. So you love takeaways, but obviously that changes where you are on the field a lot of times if the other team isn't punting or kicking off.
Pat, we talked about Travion Henderson, Mayan Williams, and how that dynamic would work out during the season. And we had all sorts of speculation during the offseason that seemed pretty logical. Travion's the Heisman Trophy caliber back, and Mayan Williams is a tremendous talent and powerful runner, but he's more of a change-up guy to just slam it ahead, get the tough yards, all those things, grind out the clock to secure a win in the fourth quarter. So it looked like 18 carry average guy, Travion Henderson, to more maybe 8 or 10 for Mayan Williams, but things might be a bit different now. And Mayan Williams has obviously carried the mail for a few weeks now, and Travion Henderson comes back. So will be interesting to see how that dynamic continues to play out.
Yeah, I got this one wrong coming into the season. I mean, I'm not the only one, but I was the believer that, look, Travion Henderson is arguably the most talented running back in the country. And if he's healthy, he's getting the lion's share of the carries. I just didn't buy that they were going to have, at one point it was a 3-headed monster when Evan Pryor was still healthy. But I just, look, you recruited the number 1 running back in the country for a reason, right? And that's not been the way it's played out. And credit to Mayan Williams for developing and becoming a player that has forced his way into, being in contention as running backs coach Tony Alford put it this week. They have 2 starting running backs in his eyes. So while Travion Henderson has started all of the games that he's been healthy for, Mayan Williams is right there in terms of carry, especially now that he, had all of the carries pretty much against Rutgers. So, I will admit that I was wrong on that one. I've been very impressed with Mayan, and Travion needs to get going. They need him to get going. I mean, let's go back a couple of years to when J.K. Dobbins and Master Teague were both in the backfield. I mean, I think Master Teague finished that year 8th in the Big Ten in rushing yards, and everyone thought, okay, they've got 2 running backs. And then you get to the college football playoff, and J.K. Dobbins goes out. Master T couldn't do it against a Clemson defense that was really talented. And I'm not saying Mayan Williams will have that problem. I think he can run against anybody in the country. But if you get towards, when you're playing Penn State, when you're playing Michigan, when you're playing a Big Ten championship game potentially against a Minnesota who has a good defense, in the college football playoff where Ohio State hopes to be, you want TreVeyon Henderson healthy. He just, that big playability that he has, and that's what we haven't seen yet this year from him. And I think we will at some point. But that is what can change a game. And if you have to slowly plod down the field with Mayan Williams, the Buckeyes are more than content to do that in the run game. But if you have those two guys and you can mix and match, you can pound it with Mayan and then try and hit some things with TreVeyon. That's the way that the Buckeyes are going to be most successful. So it was great to see Mayan break out really these last two games. But there's a reason TreVeyon Henderson's on this team, and I don't want people to forget about that.
Absolutely. And I think our other example of that was the national championship game of 2020. Trey Sermon leaves the field and it becomes Master Teague, and just the dynamic playmaking ability is just not there. And, the likelihood that you drive the ball 75 yards against a good defense at 4 and 5 yards a clip, boy, the margin for error is next to nothing. No penalties, no drop passes, always have to keep it moving, versus boom, TreVeyon Henderson got us 28 like that. Okay, it's just a different dynamic for sure. Got Pat Murphy on the line, Bucknuts 247 Sports, breaking down Ohio State football for us. The trip to East Lansing, 27-point favorite against the Spartans, who are seriously struggling. My goodness, look at their box scores if you haven't watched them play. I saw just about every play against Washington, and the focus, especially the Big Ten connection, was Michael Penix going from Indiana to Washington, and he was spectacular in that game. But what shocked me more, especially knowing Michigan State's secondary issues from last year carrying over to this year, was just you don't expect Michigan State to get manhandled on the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. Basically, Peyton Thorne was running for his life the whole game, and Keon Coleman's a really good receiver. They made plays that somewhat kept Michigan State in the game. Otherwise, they got beat down in every possible way in that game. And then, I know, my day here Saturday is recording about every game possible and trying to catch up with as much as possible. And Minnesota, Michigan State, I anticipated that being a good game, and Minnesota just put them away with over 500 yards, held them to almost nothing rushing. Again, Michigan State couldn't run the ball. Same thing last week to a lesser extent against Maryland. They're just, as soon as they hit quality teams, they haven't been able to do anything.
Yeah, it's been surprising. I mean, as I mentioned, Stephen Brooks, our 247 Sports Michigan State writer, he pointed out to me that, look, this is year 3 of a rebuild, right? Last year was better than everyone expected, but that doesn't change the fact that Michigan State is still, trying to build this back up under Mel Tucker, and the recruiting is going well and things like that. But obviously, those classes have to get on campus and grow and whatnot. So maybe we shouldn't be as surprised that they've struggled in some of these games, and especially if you look back at the Ohio State game last year. Now, let's be fair, they're dealing. Kenneth Walker III, their star running back a year ago, was ill coming into that game and didn't really play very much. And there were some other factors when we look back at that game, but I think it was a wake up call for Michigan State that, hey, you're not quite on that level yet, right? And that wasn't even an all-time great Ohio State team. But I did expect Michigan State to be better. Maybe have one non-conference loss and maybe a Big Ten loss at this point. But I thought this would be a game of two teams that the spread would be significantly tighter. I guess coming into this game was my thought when I was looking at the schedule before the season, and I've gone back and watched a good amount of Michigan State. I know there's been some injuries and whatnot for the Spartans, but it is surprising, no doubt, that they haven't been able to at least somewhat sustain what they were able to do last year. I think Peyton Thorne has struggled more than anyone expected, turning the ball over more than he has in the past, and that's no good, obviously. And then, Mel Tucker was a defensive coordinator and defensive backs coach in his earlier days, and Michigan State's defense is terrible. Their defensive backs, their secondary in general, has been ripped apart. You mentioned quarterback who did it to them, and Tanner Morgan last week. It hasn't been good. I don't know if there's a quick fix for this Michigan State team, especially with Ohio State's passing attack and Ohio State's offense coming in on Saturday. I don't know what they do. Obviously I don't cover them as close, or I don't watch them as closely as the Buckeyes, but I don't see a clear answer. And I mean, I guess that's good news for Ohio State.
Yeah, a few things are alarming is that the secondary issues were obvious last year, and they had an entire offseason to address them, both from possible personnel transactions they could have made through the transfer portal and just scheme and coaching up players. And they obviously didn't accomplish that. The other thing, I think it was Steve Hellwagon brought up the statistic. If you look at the two Big Ten quarterbacks they've faced, they're completing 82% of their passes.
Right.
And they're not dumping it down most of the time. They're hitting for big gashers.
Yeah, you want a big CJ Stroud day. This could be a big CJ Stroud day.
There you go. Absolutely. We got Ed on the line. Appreciate you being here, Ed. So with Jim Knowles' defense taking hold, a lot of optimism, a lot of positivity there. Defense is playing extremely well for the most part. You can always nitpick. At the same time, the secondary's a bit unstable right now, not just because of poor play or anything. There's been a lot of injuries there as well. So Ed's looking for a pecking order in the secondary.
Yeah, that's a good question because there have been a lot of injuries. I think at cornerback, I would say when healthy, Cam Brown has been their best corner. And I wouldn't have said that coming this season. I thought Denzel Burke had, would just grow with natural progression based on what he did as a true freshman last year. But he's certainly struggled. Now I do think, and I know that as a corner, you often either you see the play, especially if you're watching on TV, you see the play being made by either the receiver or the corner on any given play, right? If it's thrown at them, one of the guys makes the play. And so you judge it based on that. I do think there's been some plays where if you look at it from the big picture, the ball doesn't get thrown because Denzel Burke's in good coverage. So I don't want to make it sound like every play has been bad, but he has had some bad plays. And obviously playing with a broken finger in his hand or whatever it is that he's dealing with doesn't make life much easier. But I do commend him for coming back and playing last week. I think Cameron Brown's probably played the best of the cornerbacks. J.K. Johnson has impressed me a good amount. I liked what you saw from Jair Brown, the true freshman who stepped in. It's just none of them have been on the field enough to really rank those guys. If you're looking at the secondary as a whole, I think the safeties are where they've been the best in terms of defensive backs. The play of Ronnie Hickman is not surprising. He's probably been the best, arguably one of the best players on the defense, right there with Tommy Eichenberg. But, he just does so much for this defense, even if he's not getting 100 tackles like he did a year ago. I really like what Tanner McAllister has brought at that nickel position. And then Josh Proctor and Lathan Ransom have both played well, kind of rotating in there. So I think the safeties have played really well, and that's kind of helped cover up maybe some issues with some of the defensive backs or some of the youth that has had to play at the cornerback position. But yeah, to kind of rank the corners is tough just because there's been so many injuries. So I'd rank all of the safeties probably ahead and say Cameron Brown, I think, is the one who has impressed me the most.
Yeah, defensive back watching on television, you don't always get an appreciation for who's playing well. The ball may just not travel in that area. He's got a guy locked down. But after a few weeks, Tanner McAllister, of course, against Wisconsin, had a few of those kind of plays that you were like, okay, wow, that was a great play. Obviously, the one where he came from one side of the field all the way to the other side of the field to break up the pass at the goal line before halftime stands out, and the interception, of course, on Graham Mertz. Got Pat Murphy here from Bucknuts 247 Sports, breaking down Ohio State, taking on Michigan State, looking to go to 6-0, first road game of the year for the Buckeyes. So the Jim Knowles defense, again, playing well. There's always that question of, well, who have they played? That's always going to come up. Michigan's going to be, it appears, the ultimate test from an offensive skill position standpoint and offensive line. Penn State, of course, a challenge as well. So as you gather up the 5 games, Notre Dame's not as good as we thought they were going to be. Wisconsin's not as good as we thought they would be. All that business. How much have they proved to you?
Well, and I've said this before. I think I've said it to you. First of all, and this was just so noticeable in the Notre Dame game, they're doing their jobs, which I think is an indictment on the last 2 years, last year especially. But the simple things of like being in the right places, tackling, running to the football, that's all happening again, which should be commonplace for a Buckeye defense, but unfortunately wasn't the last 2 seasons. So that's progress. It's unfortunate progress, but it's progress, right? And so from there, it's okay. How can you judge a defense when they're not playing an elite offense? As you mentioned, no one, even what we thought would be the tests, have been a big test for the Buckeyes. And I think, you just have to take what's, kind of given to you. I know it's an offensive term, but handle your business, for lack of a better term. I like what I'm seeing schematically. I like that they are bringing pressure from different places. Guys are moving around pre-snap. And Jim Knowles talks about playing offense on defense and kind of dictating what the offense can do. And I think they've done that. I think it's good that it's happened the way that it has, frankly. Maybe we're not as confident as the numbers suggest. Ohio State, top 10 defense statistically and in some of the numbers. But, I think if they had been really tested early and things hadn't gone well, all of a sudden the narrative starts to change, right? And maybe guys are losing some confidence and Jim Knowles is trying to figure out what's going wrong and things like that. Now they've had success. Guys have entirely bought in and definitely have bought into what Jim Knowles is teaching. And I don't think that was a problem coming into the season, but when you have success on the field, that obviously helps enhance that. And so, I think it's only going to continue to grow and get better. And I think they have progressed every week. And I think, you saw it against Rutgers. That's what you do against a Rutgers team. You hold them to, 187 total yards or something like that, 189. That's what you should do against Rutgers. And, Ohio State hasn't done that completely the last couple of years. They've won those games and they've won those games comfortably, but it was about the offense. And last week, Rutgers scored 1 touchdown because of a fumbled punt. And then, pretty good throw. You go back to Denzel Burke and coverage there, but a pretty good throw. And then they couldn't get in the end zone the rest of the game. That's what you should do to Rutgers. You have a mistake that gives them good field position. Okay, fine. But the defense stepped up and held Rutgers pretty much out of the end zone the entire day. That's what you should do. And that's all we can judge them on right now is what they do against the opponents they've faced. And I think that, we see signs of progress each week.
The national ranking is what it is. They're number 3 right now. And, to borrow a statement that you made a few minutes ago, they need to focus on the games. They shouldn't care about the ranking.
Yeah.
But we talk about the ranking. And, of course, they need to take care of business or the ranking is going to plummet to 8 or 10 or whatever it is if they do what they did last year and lose to somebody and lose that last game of the seasons. But let's continue on the narrative that it's Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, and those two are almost the measuring stick against this program. And people are trying to figure out, is Georgia taking a step back? They looked amazing to begin. They've struggled for a couple weeks. Alabama had a rough one against Texas, but they get through that. They blast Arkansas in the 4th quarter this past week and make all those week-to-week measurements of that. I guess the one thing that could come into play is if Ohio State's as good as we think they may be, and Georgia and Alabama are the other 2, that these 3 are decidedly above anybody else. And sure, Michigan's going to have a chance to change that narrative. Clemson's there. Those would be the 2 off the top of my head, and maybe USC that would have a chance to show that they can play with those 3. You potentially get into a situation where if you believe that the AP and the coaches polls possibly impact or affect, influence the college football playoff committee, that you get into a situation where you don't want to be the 2 or 3 seed. You want to be the 1 seed. So you only have to see Alabama or Georgia. You don't have to play them both. I guess what I'm getting to is the ranking fair? Where do you stand on the ranking and how do you evaluate these teams, or how do you approach rankings?
Well, there's the preseason rankings. Yeah, there's the preseason rankings, which I know a lot of people say they're meaningless. They're not meaningless because they set the tone for the season, right? If you're
Absolutely.
ranked high, look at Michigan State. If they'd come into the season unranked instead of, I think they were 11 in the AP poll, maybe people aren't so down on Michigan State. It's just, okay, this is part of the rebuild. Now, obviously, that was affected by how they finished last year and all that. But, if you don't start the rankings, go ahead.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to interrupt,
No,
but
you're
I
fine.
think Oklahoma State is a perfect example. Oklahoma
Yeah.
State, they're undefeated right now. They beat Baylor last week. Okay, that was a nice win. But prior to that, they were 3-0 and ranked 8th in the country. Now, in a season where Oklahoma State's unranked or start the season 25 and they beat 3 bad football teams, nobody's pushing them anywhere. They're slipping out of the rankings or they're staying 20. They're not a consideration, but they have this justified number 8 ranking in the country after they beat 3 nobodies because that was the perception of them going into the season.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. And so I think there's an issue with all of that, and they're never going to get rid of those rankings because it's stuff to talk about in the preseason. And if they did, there would be other rankings that ESPN puts out stuff and other outlets put out. There's plenty of preseason hype around these teams, right? And this isn't just a college football thing. Every sport has, whether it be odds on winning the Super Bowl or whatever it is. There's always these preconceived notions of teams before they play games. But what I do like about the college football playoff rankings is they do tend to do their own thing. I mean, it is still dictated by how teams have been ranked throughout the whole year, for sure, because that's just how we view that team. But the first college football playoff ranking is always interesting to me because it lets you see how they are going to rank teams, what they're looking for. You get an idea of that, and it changes every year because there's different people in the room. And then it also lets you see, okay, where are they different from kind of the notion of the AP and coaches poll throughout the season. And, usually there are some big differences. I was talking to a friend this week who was angry that, Alabama jumped up to number 1 in the AP poll this week. And, Ohio State has better wins in his mind and whatnot. And I was like, look, if Ohio State keeps winning the way it is, and if Alabama and Georgia have some more of these tighter games, and we saw Georgia last week struggle with Missouri. Obviously, they struggled with Kent State a little bit, and Alabama obviously almost lost to Texas, which is not proving to be a good win at all. Then if you're Ohio State, keep doing what you're doing. It would not surprise me if the first college football playoff ranking had Ohio State number 1 at that point. Now, I know there's SEC bias talk and whatnot. I think that they look at it from as neutral of a perspective as you can because you have so many different people in the room with all different backgrounds. So you're going to get probably as close to fair as you can do it without bringing back the computer rankings, I think. So I like what the college football playoff rankings do. Having a show every week maybe is not necessary, but I do think the first rankings give us an interesting perspective on things. And if you're Ohio State, just keep winning because and keep winning the way you have because you're going to be in a good spot. Whether that be 1, 2, or 3, like you were saying, they're right there. And sure, being number 1 would potentially allow you to avoid playing both Alabama and Georgia, but you never know how it ends. What if Georgia loses or Alabama loses in the last game of the regular season, but then wins the SEC and then ends up the 4 seed, and now you just don't know how it's going to play out. It's not in your hands. What is in your hands is winning these games and continuing to look good doing it.
And Ohio State fans also feel fortunate that your team is given the benefit of the doubt over like 98% of the country, if not 100% of the country. It's pretty much just about everybody. So unless there's a direct loss to a team, the obvious one would be Michigan, that would knock them out of the Big Ten championship game. Let's say Maryland turns out to be pretty good, 9-3 good. That's Ohio State's stumble, but Maryland finishes in the top 15. That's their one loss. They're going to be a conference champion, one loss, and they get into the playoff. And that consideration's not given to everyone across the board. So,
and one thing I've seen a lot from Ohio State fans is not complaining necessarily, but they don't believe that Michigan is as good as their ranking, and that's fine. Michigan hasn't played anybody really either, and they haven't looked completely dominant in some of the games they've played, that Maryland game in particular. But if I'm an Ohio State fan, I want that Michigan game to be as close to 1-2 as you can get at the end of the season. Because if you win, that's a great win at the end of the year when these results get magnified, because each week we're talking about the college football playoff rankings. If you lose, God forbid, it's to a really good Michigan team, right? And so then you still have a chance, even though you're not in the Big Ten championship game, most likely, given, we're expecting Michigan to be undefeated in this scenario. You still have a shot to make it in as a, at large, whatever they call that. Because, okay, if your one loss is 3 points to Michigan, granted you did it at home, and Michigan goes out and wins the Big Ten and maybe is number 2 in the country, okay, maybe the college football playoff committee still lets you in. So I think Michigan winning each week is a good thing for Ohio State. And I think it's a good thing every year. I'm just of that thought process. But especially this year, I think it could be better for both teams if it's as highly ranked as possible of a matchup.
Pat, do we have a good idea of how severely Jackson Smith-Njigba's injury is?
Yeah, I mean, so what we know is it's a hamstring injury. My understanding from people I've talked to is that when they decided to play him against Toledo, he was feeling as good as they thought he could be. And they've got plenty of medical equipment down there. It's not just, okay, Jackson went out and ran and he feels good afterwards. He injured it again. And I've heard conflicting things from people. So I'm not really sure when. I've talked to some people that said they think it was during the game. I've talked to other people that said, well, he was practicing afterwards. So I'm not really sure when exactly, but it doesn't matter. It crept up again. And look, there's a number of reasons to be cautious with this. A, you don't need him right now. You're Ohio State and you have the deepest wide receiver room in the country, and you continue to use these guys. And all of a sudden you have a tight end that you're throwing the ball to, and you have 2 running backs that can get 100 yards any game. So putting him back out there when he's not ready to go is silly for your future and for his future, because let's be honest, Jackson Smith-Njigba, whether he plays the rest of the season or not, is headed to the NFL next year, is going to be another high draft pick. That's good for Ohio State for recruiting purposes. Last week before the game, before anyone came out onto the field to warm up, Jackson Smith-Njigba was jogging and doing some actually pretty hard runs with a trainer out there, and looked good. There was a little bit of a limp when he finished, but I thought for a guy that's being held out, and a guy that on some places of the internet there was talk that he could be done for the season, he looked pretty good running. Now he's just running a straight line. He's just kind of warming it up, and obviously he had already been ruled out for that game. So my gut, and from kind of an educated guess here, is they're going to hold Jackson out this week unless he feels absolutely 100%. The medical staff says there's no reason to be worried about it, which I just don't see happening. And you've got the bye week next week, and then you can bring him back, Iowa, Penn State, one of those 2 games when you might actually need him a bit more. And okay, you've added an extra week of recovery, and and at that point they think he will be ready to go. So that's kind of my understanding of the situation. There's obviously not a ton of information out there because Ohio State keeps a lot of that stuff under wraps when it comes to injuries. But I think we know a good amount about this. It's just hamstring injuries are difficult. You can be fine. You can feel fine walking around, even jogging. You take that one sprint and all of a sudden, guys are hurt again. And you just don't want it to become worse than it is at this point. And so given what you've got, given the schedule, I think you be cautious with this one, because I saw people talking about it in the comments here. Down the road, you will need Jackson Smith-Njigba. Be it against Michigan, be it in the Big Ten championship game, be it in the college football playoff. That guy is arguably the best receiver in the country. You want him on the field in some of those bigger games. So if it means right now he's not out there, and maybe he doesn't win the Biletnikoff because he didn't play much this season, that's fine. If he's part of a national championship at the end of the season, that's really all you care about.
No doubt. Appreciate Pat being here. Catch him on Bucknuts, of course, 247 Sports, as is the case typically. And we understand this is not our regular time and surprised a lot of you, even though we got the notification out there early to try to draw you in, that most of you have joined here in the last few minutes. So that's pretty typical. But you can circle on back and obviously watch what you missed. Pat, is there anything else that you wanted to hit on? Chat, we will give you a minute or two to hit on anything.
Yeah, I've got more time, Mark. I'm not in a hurry to jump off if there is stuff. I saw there's a question about what happened with TreVeyon Henderson last week. My understanding is it was a foot issue. I don't know any more specifics on that, but that I watched him come out for warmups before they put on the pads and everything. They warm up in t-shirts or hoodies or whatever, and he was literally he was doing it right in front of where I was standing, so he was the guy I was paying the most attention to. Looked absolutely fine, and obviously he was coming off a game where he hadn't played in the second half, or played most of the game, I guess, honestly, 2 games before that. So I paid attention, looked fine, but at some point in the warmups, he did something that didn't feel right. And from what Tony Alford told us this week, they came to the locker room. There was a conversation about, okay, this isn't normal. There's an injury here. I get the feeling that if this had been a game that Ohio State was a bit more concerned about, or if they weren't as comfortable with Mayan Williams carrying the ball 20 plus times, that TreVeyon probably could have gone. He was in uniform. He was never ruled out of the game. He was on the sideline. He was walking around. If you go back and watch the TV broadcast, you can see him, multiple times sitting there with Mayan Williams, joking around and looking happy and whatnot. So it doesn't seem to be serious. I would not be surprised if TreVeyon plays this week. Again, though, that's a guy you want down the road. If this is anything that you think can linger, you got a bye week after this. Mayan Williams can handle the rock against Michigan State if needed. So, I don't think they'll push it, but I don't think it's anywhere near as serious as the Jackson Smith and Jigba stuff, and he will likely suit up and play this weekend.
We talked about the defense needing to take steps in the right direction all off season. And then, the plethora of 5 stars all over the place, especially along the defensive front that could stand out. And one guy that certainly was respected as a gamer, a guy that's going to bring everything he has, but not necessarily at that status, was Tommy Eichenberg. But yeah, he's tearing it up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if there's one person on this team that has made a transformation from, especially like this time last year, we saw towards the end of the season, Tommy Eichenberg was playing better. He had a big Rose Bowl, at least statistically. He looks like a different player. Absolutely. And credit to him, credit to the work he's put in. He's a guy who doesn't say much. If you heard Jim Knowles' comments this week, he had this whole thing about Tommy kind of grunting back to him, which was hilarious if you've ever talked to Tommy. But it's a different level of player. He's a leader of this defense. He is making plays. He's the team's top tackler. And one of the things I think that probably hasn't been talked about enough is with the linebackers in general, not just Tommy, but it does impact Tommy, is Jim Knowles is the linebackers coach for this team. So in addition to being the defensive coordinator, that's the room he's in the most. Those are the players he works with most often. And I asked Steele Chambers after last week's game about it, just having him as their linebackers coach. And he said, he's on us about our grades after every game. He thinks it definitely makes a difference having the guy who created the defense in their room every day. And then I asked Jim Knowles about it on Tuesday, and he's used this expression a lot, seeing the forest through the trees. Basically, he thinks that, being around the linebackers a lot, it allows them to see the defense on a bigger scale. You're not just looking at it from a linebacker perspective. And I think that is something that's really helped Tommy Eichenberg. I think it's helped Steele Chambers. I think it's helping Cody Simon as he progresses. And I think it's going to help the other guys that maybe aren't playing as much, but down the road, having that big picture view of the defense is something that allows you to kind of understand what's going on and make plays that way instead of just being a linebacker. I think conversely on the offensive side, I think you're seeing that with the offensive line, because Justin Fry was an offensive coordinator in addition to being an offensive line coach when he was working with Chip Kelly at UCLA. So his perspective isn't just solely offensive line focused. It's about the entire, though that is what he does at Ohio State. It's about the entire, he understands the entire offense and how things work. And I think that helps his offensive linemen. So I think both of those things are probably things that haven't been talked about a ton. But I think there are reasons why you're seeing significant improvements, linebackers and the offensive line.
The old adage is that the backup quarterback's the least important guy in the team because obviously he's not needed, and then he's one play away from being the most important guy. We got Kyle McCord, and just obviously he's had limited action here and there, but he may get that opportunity this week.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Ryan Day was asked a couple weeks ago about Kyle and him coming into games and just handing the ball off, and he said, yeah, life as a backup quarterback can be pretty frustrating because often if you're in the game when it matters, something bad's happened, and the other times you're in the game when it doesn't matter, and that's what you do is you hand the ball off. And he did say he wants to get Kyle more passes and kind of get him reps throwing the ball a bit more, but you also don't want to just go out there when you're up big against a team and throw the ball all over them. You saw him do it a little bit against Rutgers. I think that we do a little bit overestimate that factor of the game. Let's remember, CJ Stroud had never thrown a college pass before he started his first game last year in Minnesota. Now, there were some hiccups along the way early on. He did have interceptions early in the year, and maybe that was shoulder related, maybe that was inexperience, but a lot of backup quarterbacks don't get a ton of throws before they step in and start. I think you can go back through some of the best teams in the country, and when they've moved on to the next guy who's then had success, it doesn't mean that he's had a ton of success previously as the backup. So yeah, they would love the opportunity without CJ Stroud being hurt to have Kyle McCord go out there and throw the ball 15 times. But also remember, Kyle McCord started a game last year. It's not like he is completely inexperienced in terms of throwing the ball around, and he was pretty good in that game. So yes, you'd love to have more experience for him, but you also have to kind of manage the game the way that it plays out, and that often means just getting him in there, and that's still experience. Being in there in front of 100,000 at Ohio Stadium is good experience for him, whether he throws the ball or not.
All right, everyone. Appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football, Ohio State. If you're not aware, and most of you should be, that we've got Wednesday's show with Steve Hellwagon, Kevin Noon, Tody Gerdeman, 11 a.m. Eastern Time every Wednesday. Catch Pat's work at Bucknuts 247 Sports. So it's bucknuts.com. Get on over there. Check out his work on Ohio State football. Is there anything in particular you're featuring headed toward Michigan State?
What did I do this week? I wrote something about Mayan, just kind of how he came through the, he wasn't a highly recruited guy. He wasn't a guy that was originally committed to Ohio State. And, Tony Alford admitted he had to go and apologize to Mayan for sort of the way that they, he kind of judged him because he's a quiet kid. So it was interesting talking to Tony Alford about that, and just, he wasn't the guy that was high on their list originally. And so I wrote about that. That was probably the big story I did this week. But yeah, we had some good stuff this week at Bucknuts. Go check it out.
There we go. Pat, always appreciate you stopping by and breaking it down for us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Enjoy the trip.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week or sometime soon. Appreciate it.
Sounds good.
All right, everybody else will be live. Let's see, tonight with West Virginia live at 8 Eastern Time. And we got a Nebraska postgame show where our postgame host can't make it. So that falls on me. So I'll see you after the Nebraska game on the Nebraska channel as well. Pat, appreciate it once again. Everybody else, enjoy the games this weekend.